Overlap of autism and ADHD. This is a research-based video. The research is done by doctors and professional researchers. This special video is specifically about understanding executive functioning, particularly in autism. So, today we will talk about a domain of cognitive functioning that is very important for all children and adults, but can be an area of vulnerability for children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Disabilities including Autism Spectrum Disorder and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD. I suppose we all know about ASD, or as you say, Autism Spectrum Disorder. But I'll still define it in few words, so if there is anybody new in our viewers. Because we will discuss two types of main areas. Social communication. This includes following problems. Social emotional reciprocity, and that's kind of the back and forth of social interactions. Trouble with initiating or beginning social interactions. Having fluid conversations, sharing your interest with others, sharing an emotional experience, sharing your affects or kind of your facial expressions, having a limited interest in asking others to join in with you, trouble with non-verbal communication behaviors, limited eye contact or use of understanding of gestures for communication like head nodding again or facial expressions, body language, as well as difficulty appreciating personal space. It's not important that someone with ASD must be facing all these problems. Children with autism often have difficulty developing and maintaining and understanding relationships, and this can range just from difficulties adjusting your behaviors to the various social contacts or difficulties in sharing an imaginative play or making and maintaining friends. The second criteria for autism includes restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors. Repetitive patterns of behavior certainly can be troublesome for some individuals with autism. They also make these kind of unique, and so criteria B, these repetitive and rigid patterns of behavior include those stereotypes, repetitive motor movements like the hand slapping, the lining up of toys and objects, and also can include repetitive language. This B category also includes sameness, inflexible adherence to routine, difficulty transitioning, hyper-focused interests. Now, what difference does it make? Why we have to improve in these fields? There are a number of reasons, like an abnormal intensity or focus in one topic that can be all-consuming and that's often to the exclusion of other topics. Differences in sensory functioning. So that can be to pain or temperature, to sounds, to textures, to smells, as well as visuals. And that can be either a hyper or a hyposensitivity to these sensory inputs. And so as I read through these symptoms, you can probably imagine how there could be an overlap with other neurodevelopmental conditions. Let's look at a list of childhood disorders that need to be considered when you are evaluating for autism. These also share some symptoms with each other, and the overlap is with autism too. A receptive expressive language disorder shares communication difficulties. Anxiety really overlaps with some of those repetitive thoughts and behaviors. Intellectual disability overlaps with both communication and repetitive behavior. Don't worry, we are going to discuss our main topic of autism and ADHD overlap, but I have to make some things clear first. Learning disability can overlap with some of the communication difficulties, and Tourette syndrome can overlap with some of the repetitive behaviors. Even giftedness can overlap with repetitive topics, advanced vocabulary, and there are others as well. Actually, we try not to give too many labels to any individual. It can be important to provide these multiple labels, as sometimes all of a child's needs may not be fully described by a single label. Now, talking about ADHD and autism, you have to keep in mind what we actually discussed above, the overlap of autism with other disabilities and what autism is, because I will be referring to that later on. So I want to briefly go over the symptoms of ADHD. So in the category of inattention would fall failing to pay close attention to details or sustaining your attention. Now let's list down the symptoms. Trouble following through on instructions, finishing schoolwork or chores, trouble with organization, avoiding things that require a lot of attention, losing things or forgetting things a lot. So you can imagine this is the child walking down the hallway with the papers falling out of their backpack. The second criteria includes hyperactivity and impulsivity, fidgeting, getting out of your chair when you're supposed to be sitting, running or climbing on things a lot, always acting like you're on the go, trouble playing quietly or talking excessively, blurring out answers before the question is complete, trouble waiting your turn. These symptoms cannot be brief. They have to be present for at least 6 months. As this one child might not display all of these symptoms, you can talk about ADHD as being primarily inattentive. So they have those symptoms in the first category, but not the second. You can talk about it being primarily hyperactive, impulsive, which would be those symptoms in the second category, but not very many in the first and then the combined type. So you have symptoms in both of these categories. And that's the most common type of ADHD that we just typically think of. Both kids with autism and ADHD have social difficulties often, and so you can imagine how these manifest trouble making friends. But they might be driven by different symptoms. And so if we think about autism, if you don't talk to people a lot and you don't communicate both verbally and non-verbally, you don't seek enjoyment to share with others, you don't have that back and forth fluidity, you're not reciprocal in your play, you can see how peers might not be as accepting of you. Similarly, if you are interrupting and intruding on others a lot, you have difficulty listening. When you are spoken to, you talk a lot. You can't play quietly, and when you do play, you cannot kind of stay on track. You can see again how peers might not want to hang out with you as much either. And so all these things can lead to troubles socially. Similarly, you can imagine how repetitive behavioral features can result from symptoms of either one of autism or ADHD. So classically, obviously, the stereotype motor movements, the flapping, the pacing, the rocking, lining up toys, flipping. These all are repetitive behaviors that are seen in autism. And then, if you think about ADHD, if you're always on the go driven by a motor, you might be pacing, you might be rocking in your seat. But is that truly a motor stereotype? You might be tapping your hands or feet. You have trouble sitting still. You can be messy or disorganized. And that kind could resemble some sort of repetitiveness to your play or your activities. And so again, we share the outcome that there can be repetitive behaviors, but they really are of a different quality. And so in fact, the motor domain is another great example of where autism and ADHD can show similarities and differences. In a study conducted at Kennedy Creek, children were asked to hold the handle of a robotic arm that was covered by a screen, and they used the robotic arm to play a game to capture targets. And those targets were animals that had escaped from a zoo. The child received both visual feedback and proprioceptive feedback, which is pressure from the robotic arm. On this test, they found that children with autism showed a slower rate of learning and relied more on that appropriate pressure feedback than the visual feedback to perform the task. And children with ADHD, on the other hand, showed excessive variability in their motor speed. There were differences here in their performances and how they learn motor tasks. In another study, we found evidence of specificity and autism for poor catching and balance skills, which these were not seen in ADHD, which can translate to difficulty with coupling. If we talk all this together, coupling visual and temporal feedback to adjust your movements, and in real life, this relates to smooth coordination. And it can affect how you play sports, and we know that's a big social outlet for our children these days. There also are some motor similarities that we did see, particularly in fine motor dexterity. So difficulties with that, as that also relates to handwriting, which we see in both of these groups. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these shared biological factors between autism and ADHD. So the sex distribution, they are both predominantly male for autism. It's about 4:1. There's some variability and some of those findings, but we'll just say 4:1. Boys to girls, males to females, and it's about 2:1 boys to girls, male to females, and ADHD from a genetic perspective. It's estimated that about 50 to 70% of the genetic factors can overlap between the disorders, and if there's also shared differences in the structure of the brain as well as how the brain communicates or sends signals between different parts of the brain. So that's functionality of the brain. So first we'll talk about some of the differences and similarities. and structure. So from this figure, I'm not expecting you to appreciate all the nonsenses of what's shown, but I want you to focus on these different colors. And so again, this figure shows the structure MRI findings from kids with autism and kids with ADHD. So these green regions show where autism and ADHD show similar differences from typical measurements. Okay, so what you'll see in this lower back part of the brain called the cerebellum that contributes to motor coordination, imbalance, as well as the corpus callosum, which helps the two hemispheres of the brain communicate with each other. So though there are similarities between these brains of kids with autism and ADHD, there are differences too, and that's highlighted in blue. And so the blue highlights areas where autism shows increases in the volume and ADHD actually shows decreases in brain volume. This includes the prefrontal cortex, which we are going to talk a bit about as it relates to executive functioning, as well as the basal ganglia here, which has a variety of functioning, but of those include motor coordination and motor learning. And then lastly, the red indicates regions primarily implicated in autism, and that includes the temporal lobe, which is where auditory information is processed. But also the temporal lobe is involved in language comprehension and memory and emotional association, and differences are also along those lines, seen in the amygdala, which is involved further in emotional processing. Here again, this slide reviews the structural differences and similarities, but there is also some suggestion of functional differences and similarities between autism and ADHD. Particularly suggests that there is some long-range interconnectivity in the communication of the brain regions, as well as short-range overconnectivity. So in other words, there are fewer long-range connections and more short-range connections. So what that means is these long-range connections are really involved in information and sensory processing and integration, attention, socialization and communication. They're also very involved in executive functioning, and so those are implicated in some of the challenges that these kids have in these areas. Additionally, short-range connections have been suggested to contribute to the repetitive patterns of behavior and getting kind of stuck in those details. There's obviously still a lot of work ongoing in the neurology of autism and ADHD. It's one, but it's likely that there's some kind of combination of these structural and functional differences that contribute to the complex variability in individual symptom presentations that are seen across the spectrum of autism and ADHD. So we have talked about some similarities and differences. Another difference is in the trajectory of brain development, and so despite some of this overlap, again, there are some differences. And so in autism, we see an early, rapid and pervasive increase in brain size during infancy and toddlerhood, which can result in some children having larger brain head circumference, is followed by an arrested development in later childhood and potential decline into pre to adolescence into adulthood, where there is somewhat we call over pruning of connections versus in ADHD. It seems to be that there's more cortical maturation that's delayed several years compared to typically developing children. But there is some kind of catch-up that typically cortical volumes are attained by later adolescence or early adulthood. So there's definitely some differences there. At this point, we have only talked about children with either autism or ADHD. But we know that children with autism can also have ADHD, so that's comorbidity, right? So this study, and again, not asking you to appreciate all the nonsenses on this video, but this is a study that provides you information about the brains of autism and ADHD, because it includes kids with autism with and without ADHD, and it relates to specifically to motor functioning. But what this study found was that there are differences in the motor circuit anatomy based on whether ADHD was comorbid or not. And at the relationship between the motor system differences varied based on ADHD comorbidity status. And so, as some of these findings actually suggested more typical brain morphology and motor performance in the ADHD and autism group. So then that comorbid group 1 explanation was that the ADHD was somewhat protective, and as the brain development and ADHD is kind of more delayed rather than variable. The comorbid ADHD group did not always have more typical brain and motor findings, It was also suggested that autism with comorbid ADHD may reflect a separate neuro and a phenotype. What that means is a separate kind of brain behavior relationship from either autism or ADHD. So we are going to talk a little bit more about that. Before we do, I'd like to talk about some similar and shared behavioral factors, and it's just particularly I'd like to talk about executive functioning. So executive functioning challenges are present in both autism and ADHD, and there's some evidences to suggest that those with both autism and ADHD are even greater risk for executive functioning challenges, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. After we first talk about executive functioning, I like to think of it as the puppet master of the brain, which coordinates all the individual thinking skills to work as a whole, and these are really the skills that allow us to develop from a fully dependent child to an independent adult. So again, it requires the ability to plan ahead and sequence complex behaviors, to simultaneously attend to multiple sources of information, to grasp the gist of a complex situation, to resist distraction and interference, inhibit inappropriate responses, and sustain behavior for prolonged periods of time. That's a lot of high-level tasks, right? But it also can be separated into subdomains, which include cognitive, behavioral, and emotional regulation. So with regulation kind of being at the heart of it, however, later regulator thinking how we regulate our behaviors and how we regulate our emotions. And so under the cognitive piece, we are thinking about how we regulate our attention, how we set goals, how we manage our time, how we problem solving novel sensual situations, how we think flexibly, how we use our good judgment behaviorally. We got to initiate tasks, kind of get that motor going. We got to inhibit automatic responses. Sometimes for a better response, we have to sustain our effort. We have to control our impulses and delay gratification. And we have to anticipate future consequences. Emotional regulation includes the modulation of your emotional arousal in your mood and how you can soothe to yourself. And so, if we think about how all of these things can help you complete a task, let's take a real-world example of executive functions run amok a book report. Written expression and long-term projects for school-age and older children is one of the most taxing tasks demanding of executive functioning. It involves cognitive elation. You have to plan ahead for all the steps involved. First, you got to read the material, then you got to outline the report, you got to organize your thoughts, you got to physically put it in writing, whether it be handwritten or typed, you got to proofread. Lots of steps involved. You got to turn it in, not to mention the time management, so not to spending too much time on any of those steps, not waiting to the last minute. You have to regulate. So those are some of the cognitive pieces. But think about behavior regulation. You got to set the goal and stick to it. You can't get distracted by more preferred activities, video games, and then you got to delay that gratification. So I have to do all of this work so that maybe in a week or so I get a grade back from a teacher to translate it into what then you got to regulate your motion. So this can be a very difficult task for typically developing kids, for kids with autism or kids with ADHD or any combination, and so it can certainly cause a lot of frustration. So you have to put those kind of coping strategies in place throughout the long-term process, so that you don't let kind of your mood and your emotions get in the way of you completing the task. So we are going to quickly go back into the brain again. So where executive functions are controlled, or again by those frontal lobes, those are the areas all up here. And interestingly, our frontal lobes are later to develop as the brain matures from back to front through childhood and into adolescence and even into our 20s. And so it's the connections that the brain is refining between its different parts that allows for executive functioning to kind of do its things. And again, that's happening from back to front. So the frontal lobes are kind of the last ones to really mature. As these connections strengthens over time, our brain becomes more efficient and how it approaches problems. This kind of the brain is developing in parallel to what we expect from kids. That's why we expect more planful and organized behavior from an adult versus an adolescent versus a small child, and environmentally, we provide less support and supervision as child or children age. as we are expecting that they are more capable of independently managing greater responsibility, and a lot of that is due to those frontal lobes in their maturation. However, for our kids with autism and ADHD, who typically experience weaknesses and delays in their executive functioning development, we really need to be maintaining those supports instead of pulling back on them as we attempt to teach them the strategies they need to help compensate them to use their skills. And then as children grow older, of the course, the stakes grow bigger. So I think graduation potential for higher education or stable employment. And so, executive functioning challenges present in both autism, ADHD, and autism plus ADHD. So for our kids with autism, these rigid and routine-based ways of thinking, so that certainly can get it in the way of, holding down a job if you're not going to be flexible when your boss asks you to do a task a different way. Your boss is probably not going to be coming back to you very often if you're so hyper-focusing your interest and you're not kind of open to doing non-preferred activities. That's hard then to maintain employment if that's not in your hyper-focus interest, rigidity, and social dynamics. So, there's for many jobs, there are social dynamics to manage, even just having a boss as a social relationship as well. And so being able to flexibly manage those, and then efficient and abstract reasoning versus getting stuck in the details. So a lot of our kids with autism can get to the right answer. They just don't kind of take the straight route, and so that can also mean they are kind of taking longer to get there. And in our fast-paced world with such an emphasis on efficiency, that can be problematic. This is the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2. Please subscribe our channel and press the bell icon.